The war did not end with a bang for the Reitsch family. It did not end with the triumphant roar of Allied engines or the visible collapse of a regime they had known for 12 long years. Instead, it ended in a quiet, sterile room, nestled within the picturesque safety of the Austrian Alps. With the methodical, rhythmic click of a pistol, history often focuses its lens on the monumental firestorms of Berlin, the desperate street fighting in the ruins of the Reichstag, or the thunderous artillery duels on the Eastern Front. Yet, the true psychological collapse of the German bourgeoisie, the respectable middle class that had underpinned the state, occurred in isolated, suffocating moments like this. It was a collapse defined by silence, followed by an irrevocable decision that no amount of post-war rebuilding could ever undo. By May 1945, the Reitsch family had achieved what millions of their compatriots could only dream of in their darkest hours. They had escaped the closing jaws of the conflict. Led by the patriarch, Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch, they had fled the advancing Soviet army in Silesia, leaving behind a life of comfort for the uncertainty of the road. They had traversed hundreds of miles of a collapsing empire, moving through a landscape of burning cities and shattered infrastructure to reach the American occupation zone in Salzburg. On paper, they were the fortunate ones. They were educated, respected, and undeniably privileged. Wilhelm was not a fanatic in a black uniform. He was an ophthalmologist, a man whose life had been dedicated to science, medicine, and the restoration of sight. His wife, Emmy, was a devout Catholic, a woman whose moral compass was theoretically rooted in the sanctity of life. Their daughter, Heidi, was not a combatant but a mother, whose primary instinct during those grueling months of flight was simply to shield her 3 young children from the biting cold and the hunger of the trek. They had reached the sanctuary. The Americans were there, representing a predictable, if foreign, order. The much-feared Soviet forces, the spectre of the East, were hundreds of miles away. By all logic of survival, the Reichs had won. They had crossed the finish line. But in the twisted psychology of 1945, logic had long since been replaced by a pervasive, poisonous dread that seeped into the marrow of the defeated. For the German professional class, the end of the war was not a liberation. It was the end of the world as they understood it. The prestige they held, the social structures they occupied, and the very ground of their identity were dissolving. In the vacuum left by the retreating Reich, fear became the only remaining authority. A rumor began to circulate through the cramped refugee lodgings in Salzburg. It was a whisper, baseless, but potent, suggesting that the Americans intended to forcibly repatriate refugees back to the east, handing them over to the Soviet zone. For a man like Wilhelm Reitsch, who had spent 12 years absorbing state propaganda about the Mongol hordes and the unspeakable, brutal fate awaiting Germans in Soviet hands, this rumor was not merely gossip. It was a death sentence delivered in a hallway. The doctor looked at his wife, his daughter, and his small grandchildren, and he no longer saw survivors who had made it to safety. Through the distorted lens of his fear, he saw victims in waiting, destined for a degradation he could not bear to witness. He was a man trained to fix things, to intervene, to prevent suffering. In the warped morality of a collapsing society, he decided to perform one final intervention. In his mind, the protector had one final, terrible duty to perform. He believed that death was a cleaner, more honorable alternative to the perceived dishonor of capture or repatriation. This was the ultimate failure of the bourgeois imagination, the inability to envision a life after defeat, or a world where they were no longer the masters of their own narrative. On the night of May 3rd, 1945, just 5 days before the official unconditional surrender of Germany, Dr. Reitsch prepared for his final procedure. It was not an act of chaotic panic or a sudden burst of madness. It was executed with the chilling, detached precision of a professional. There were no enemy soldiers at the door. There was no shelling to mask the sound. There was only a 70-year-old man who had convinced himself that murder was the highest, most refined form of mercy. He viewed the lives of his family not as individual journeys, but as extensions of his own responsibility lives that he had the right and the duty to terminate before they could be spoiled by the enemy. He moved through the lodging with the steady hand of a surgeon. First, his wife, Emmy, the companion of his life and his faith. Then his daughter, Heidi, who had trusted him to lead them to safety. And then the children, Hans, Jürgen, Ellen. These were children under the age of 10, innocent of the politics of their elders, whose only crime was being born into a timeline that their grandfather had decided to truncate. He shot them one by one, a cold succession of rounds that ended generations of potential in a matter of minutes. He spared them a future he could not imagine by ensuring they had no future at all. He chose the silence of the grave over the uncertainty of the peace. Finally, having cleared the room of the living, he turned the weapon on himself, completing the circle of destruction. 6 bodies lay in a room in the American zone, surrounded by the very safety they had sought. The irony is devastating in its cruelty. The Americans never intended to send them back. The Soviets never came to Salzburg. The danger that prompted this massacre existed entirely within the mind of a man who thought he was saving his family, while in reality, he became the very executioner he feared. He had brought the violence of the front line into the domestic sphere, turning the home into a slaughterhouse in the name of protection. While this tragedy unfolded in the heavy silence of Austria, another Reitsch was making headlines amidst the smoking ruins of Berlin. Hanna Reitsch, the world-famous test pilot, and the daughter of the man who had just annihilated her family, was in American custody. Hanna was the true believer, the physical manifestation of the regime's fanatical spirit. She was the woman who had flown a light aircraft into the heart of a burning Berlin, dodging Soviet anti-aircraft fire, just to be by her Führer's side in his final days. She had stood in the gloom of the Führer bunker and begged to stay, pleading for the privilege to die with Hitler. She viewed a spectacular, televised death as the ultimate honor, the crowning achievement of a life dedicated to the Third Reich. But Hitler had ordered her to leave. He had given her a mission to fly out, to save herself, perhaps to ensure a witness remained. She had survived against her will, bitter that she had been denied the martyrdom she craved. When the Americans interrogated her, they found her useful. She was a unique intelligence asset, a primary witness to the final, delusional hours of the Nazi leadership. It was during this period of captivity, while she was being treated with the curiosity afforded to a celebrity prisoner, that she was handed the news. Her father, her mother, her sister, and the children were all dead. The family she had left behind in the safety of the mountains had been erased by the very hand she expected to protect them. Witnesses described her reaction as a total collapse into misery. But as we look back from the distance of history, we must examine the profound moral dissonance at the heart of this family. Hanna, who wore the Iron Cross with pride and worshipped the ideology of death before dishonor, had lived. She had survived the fire of Berlin and the collapse of the regime. Meanwhile, the family members who simply wanted to survive, who had no part in the high-stakes political theater of the bunker or the soaring rhetoric of the Luftwaffe, were the ones who paid the ultimate price of that ideology. The father had acted out the nihilism that the daughter had preached. Hanna had romanticized the concept of a heroic death. Wilhelm had practiced the grim reality of it. There is a third figure in this portrait, one who remains largely in the shadows, yet speaks volumes about the post-war German experience. Kurt Reitsch, Hanna's brother and a naval officer. He was not in the bunker, nor was he in that room in Salzburg when the shots were fired. He survived the war and eventually settled in Hamburg, a city being rebuilt from the ashes. For 46 years, until his death in 1991, he lived a life of absolute, impenetrable silence regarding these events. He did not seek the spotlight, nor did he allow the tragedy to define his public persona. Kurt represents the vast majority of the post-war German population, the generation of the silent. He did not give interviews to international magazines. He did not write memoirs attempting to justify the family's actions. He did not defend Hitler, nor did he publicly condemn his father for the murder of his sister and nibblings. He simply existed. He built a wall of silence around the trauma, perhaps because there are no words in any language to reconcile the fact that your father murdered your family to save them from a ghost. This silence was the foundation upon which the new, normal Germany was built, a society that moved forward by refusing to look back at the horrors that had occurred in the quiet corners of private homes. Hanna, conversely, refused to be silent, and she refused to change. Once released by the Americans, she returned to the world of aviation with a chilling lack of introspection. She set new records, proving her skill hadn't faded with the Reich. In 1961, she even shook hands with President John F. Kennedy at the White House, a celebrated figure in the international gliding community, all while wearing the Iron Cross that Hitler himself had pinned on her. She spent the rest of her life as an unrepentant apologist, defending the reputation of the dictator and claiming that the world had misunderstood him. She maintained a steadfast denial of the Holocaust, choosing to live in a curated reality where the regime remained untarnished. She died in 1979, a living ghost of a fallen era. Her final letter to a friend contained a cryptic, haunting line. "It began in the bunker. There it shall end." Some historians suggest this implies a delayed suicide, a final fulfillment of the death wish she was denied in 1945. For Hanna, the war never truly ended. She simply waited for the world to catch up to her own internal stasis. The story of the Reitsch family offers no comfort to the historian or the casual observer. It offers no path to redemption or easy moral lessons. Instead, it leaves us with a brutal, recurring paradox of the 20th century. The innocent, the children and the mother, who sought only a peaceful life, died by the hand of their supposed protector. The guilty, or at least those most complicit in the ideology that fueled the fire, survived to live full, celebrated lives. The truth of what happened in Salzburg was buried under a layer of respectable, middle-class silence, hidden away like a shameful secret that might disrupt the rebuilding of a nation. Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch undoubtedly believed he was acting out of a profound, if distorted, love. He believed he was sparing his grandchildren from a darkness he couldn't name. But in the end, he only proved that fear is a far more efficient and intimate killer than any invading army. He did the enemy's work for them, destroying his own bloodline out of a terror of what might happen, rather than what was actually happening. The war ended for the rest of the world in May 1945, with flags and celebrations and the slow beginning of peace. But for the Reitsch family, the war won. It claimed them not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, desperate corners of the human mind, proving that the shadows of conflict often linger longest where we feel the most secure